members asked for help, thus further endangering all present. These are fundamental threats not just to people's lives, but to the very foundation of our republic. And now I'd like to show what members of Congress said leading up to the most bipartisan impeachment vote in U.S. history. Because I do want everyone watching, especially President Trump's supporters, to see firsthand what I believe we all feel, that what President Trump did was not appropriate, that it was not American, and that it absolutely cannot stand.
What he has done and what he has caused here is something that we've never seen before in our history.
All indications are that the president has become unmoored, not just from his duty, nor even his oath, but from reality itself.
Yikes. Damn, they
The
said
president's
that
role in
about
this
him.
insurrection is undeniable, both on social media ahead of January 6th and in his speech that day. He deliberately promoted baseless theories, creating a combustible environment of misinformation and division. To allow the President of the United States to incite this attack without consequences is a direct threat to the future of this democracy.
After this trial, I hope you'll come together and cast your vote and make absolutely clear how we as a Congress and as a nation feel about what Donald Trump did by convicting him. And to prevent this from being only the beginning, as President Trump said, and to deter future presidents who do not like the outcome of a national election from believing they can follow in President Trump's footsteps. It is what our Constitution requires. It is what our country deserves.
Representative DeGette will now return to show how extremists were emboldened by the insurrection and plan to attack the inauguration.
Uh-oh. They planned to attack the inauguration. I knew this, but wondered why. Well, I mean, obviously, they brought the National Guard in, but I wondered why people at least didn't protest J20. A lot of my friends caught federal charges for J20 in 2016.
My colleagues have showed you the overwhelming evidence of how President Trump's conduct assembled, incited, and inflamed the mob. We showed how and why this attack, this violence, was not only foreseeable, but preventable. We showed that President Trump knew his conduct could and would result in violence, and that when the attack occurred, he did not fulfill his duty as commander-in-chief and defend us.
Sure didn't.
Instead, he was delighted. Donald Trump incited a violent insurrection, and he failed to defend our nation, our Capitol, this Congress, and our law enforcement from the attack he incited. Now I want to turn to the impact, the long-term harm of this conduct. My colleagues and I will walk through the breadth and gravity of this harm. I'd like to start with the effect President Trump's conduct had on our domestic security. We saw firsthand how Donald Trump's conduct emboldened and escalated domestic violence extremists. These folks are known in the law enforcement community as DVEs. These threats were and are made worse by President Trump's refusal to take accountability and his refusal to forcibly denounce what his own FBI identified as some of the most dangerous elements of our country. Even as the attack was underway, he tweeted words of support to his violent supporters. And then, in the aftermath on January 7th, President Trump made it clear this was only the beginning.
And to all of my wonderful supporters, I know you are disappointed,
Thanks, Bill.
but I also want you to know that our incredible journey is only just beginning.
And he was right. Unless we take action, the violence is only just beginning. In the aftermath of the attack, we saw a huge rise in threats from domestic violent extremists, including specific threats to the inauguration in D.C. and also to all 50 state capitals. Our intelligence agencies confirmed that in addition to these specific threats, President Trump's conduct emboldened the very same violent groups who initiated the attack.
Now, this is still
and
receipts
sparked
on Trump.
New
That's what's
violent
crazy.
coalitions.
This is still receipts on him.
These groups believe that they're following his orders. They believe that their acts of insurrection and violence are patriotic. Violence is never patriotic, and it's never American. It's not the Democratic way, and it's not the Republican way. After the attack,
they got
the
even more
nation's
heat.
top defense
They're
and
talking
law
about how,
enforcement agencies
right now they're talking
reported
about
an
how they
increase
plan
in credible
to,
threats to the inauguration from
the
Donald
inauguration.
Trump's supporters. On January 13, 2021, a joint intelligence bulletin issued by the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and the National Counterterrorism Center found, quote, since the 6th January event, violent online rhetoric regarding the 20 January presidential inauguration has increased, with some calling for unspecified, quote, justice for the 6th January fatal shooting by law enforcement of a participant who had illegally entered the Capitol building, and another posting that, quote, many armed individuals would return on 19 January. The agencies also made clear why these threats were escalating, especially regarding the inauguration. The report explained that a primary motivating factor was, quote, the shared false narrative of a stolen election and opposition to the change in control of the executive and legislative branches of the federal government may lead some individuals to adopt the belief that there is no political solution to address their grievances and that violent action is necessary. In other words, President Trump's spreading of inflammatory disinformation about the election incited the insurrection on January 6th and may lead to further violence. Online, just as they did prior to the January 6th attack, Trump supporters took to the internet to organize and document their desire and plans for future violence at President Biden's inauguration.
Yep.
And
I knew
indeed,
that was coming.
in the days shortly after the
I can't
attack,
wait to see what heat they got.
several posters on extremist social media websites made further plans for violence. They posted, quote, many of us will return, will never forget. We will come in numbers no standing army or police agency can match. Quote, we took the building once and we can take it again. Other users, eager to participate in additional attacks, confirmed that they were waiting on President Trump's instructions about what to do next.
That's so
Referring
wild.
to a future planned attack, a user on the online platform known as Gab posted, quote,
Gab.
I'd like to come do this, but want to know, does our president want us there? Awaiting instructions. In fact, in the days leading up to the inauguration, multiple individuals, many potentially in an attempt to carry out the plots that I just previewed, were arrested in Washington, D.C., including on serious weapons charges. One of those men was Couy Griffin, the founder of
Around Big
Cowboys
Richard
for
Lizard
Trump,
Man.
who took part in the Capitol attack and was also arrested on January 17th. Here's what he said about his plans for violence.
You know, you want to say that that was a mob? You want to say that was a violence? No, sir. No, ma'am. No, we could have a Second Amendment rally on those same steps that we had that rally yesterday. You know, and if we do, then it's going to be a sad day because there's going to be blood running out of that bird. We will plant our flag on the desk of Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer.
Yo, hold
Blood
on.
running
Is he
out
still-
of the building. This building, the Capitol, where all of us are right now.
He just got
Now,
out
the
of jail
name Couy
6
Griffin
days
may
ago,
sound
too.
familiar because he previously faced controversy for a May 2020 video where he said, quote, "The only good Democrat is a dead Democrat."
Jesus
Hear it from him
Christ,
yourself.
dude. I mean, that's based,
Now,
but
when he said this,
he's a fascist.
President Trump actually retweeted Griffin and thanked him for that sentiment.
Retweeted him. Yo. Oh my God, dude.
When Donald Trump retweeted this, he was no stranger to Griffin. In fact, in March 2019, over a year earlier, Griffin and Trump had spoken on the phone for nearly 30
I'm not
minutes.
surprised. I'm just
President
shocked
Trump's
that he
conduct,
was this.
without a doubt, made it clear
Look at
that
him.
he said about President Trump retweeting his inflammatory comment about the dead Democrats, quote, "It really means a lot to me because I know the President of the United States has my back."
This is so.
Remember, this is a man who was here on January 6th, who was arrested after threatening to come back here to make blood come running out of this building.
That's so wild.
Threats like Griffin's have triggered a deployment of force. There were approximately 25,000 National Guard troops brought in from around the country to protect D.C. leading up to and on Inauguration Day. As you know, many of those troops are still here. Take a look
They're
at that.
still there. Wow.
These were scenes that played out all over the country. 5 days following the siege on the Capitol on January 11, 2021, through at least 20 January, and at the U.S. Capitol from
95 Live?
17
Word. I'll come
January
check it
through
out.
20
I'm trying to play
January.
that too.
As a result, at least 21 states activated their National Guards in preparation for potential attacks. President Trump's incitement has reverberated around the country, prompting massive law enforcement mobilization in several state capitals, including Washington, Illinois, Michigan,
That's so
and
nuts.
Georgia. Look at these photos. This is what Donald Trump has done to America. This massive deployment of law enforcement has cost the taxpayers dearly. The National Guard deployment to D.C. alone is expected to cost at least $480 million. The bills are already also racking up in the states. North Carolina, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Utah, and Wisconsin have each spent about $500,000 to safeguard their capitals in the run-up to the inauguration.
I'm not surprised by Ohio at all, honestly.
Spent $1.2 million
Being from Dayton.
over the same two-week period. And remember, this is at a time when state budgets are already suffering under the weight of the pandemic. Our brave service members showed up. Thanks to their dedication and their vigilance, the inauguration and the days leading up to it mercifully proceeded without incident.
Ohio has the most number
In
of hate
fact,
groups, active
after
hate
news
groups in the
broke of
country
law
now, dude.
enforcement's preparedness for
Ohio,
further
they get busy in
attacks,
Ohio.
leaders of the
There's a
Proud
reason why
Boys,
my parents
the Three
moved out there.
Percenters Militia, the organizers of the Million MAGA March, they all now told their followers to avoid protests up to or leading up to the inauguration for fear that law enforcement would crush them and arrest rioters who showed up.
They get busy in Ohio, Sock.
Thank God there wasn't an insurrection sequel here on January 20th. But look at the
I
price
thought there
we've
was going to be
paid.
a sequel.
The price that we're still paying. It's not just dollars and cents. This capital has become a fortress, as state capitals have all across the country. Our constituents no longer have access to the elected representatives. Every Democrat and Republican, including people who came here on January 6th peacefully, is paying the price. And it's not just a loss of access. It's a dimming of their freedom. It's a dimming of all of our freedom. We must uphold our oaths, as the tens of thousands of law enforcement officers have done in the wake of January 6th. Because if we do not, President Trump's mob stands
Craig,
ready
for the like.
for more attacks. Now, this should be no surprise. Having a commander-in-chief who incites violence has given life to the existing violent groups he spent years cultivating, and has inspired new coalitions among extremist groups who actually view January as a success. According to the FBI, President Trump's assemblage of his mob was particularly dangerous because, quote, in-person engagement between DVEs of differing ideological goals during the Capitol breach likely served to foster connections which may increase DVE's willingness, capability, and motivation to attack and undermine a government they view as illegitimate. In other words, they all got to talking to each other. This bulletin by our own Intelligence Committee was also confirmed by concrete evidence. Rioters celebrated their roles in the January 6th attack on social media. They boasted about their success in breaching the Capitol and forcing members of Congress and the Vice President to evacuate. Take, for example, right-wing provocateur Nick Fuentes. The day before the Capitol insurrection, Fuentes said this on his internet show.
What can you and I do to a state legislator besides kill him? Although we should not. I'm not advising that, but I mean, what else can you do, right?
Fuentes was at the Capitol on January 6th and praised the insurrection on a live stream as glorious and awe-inspiring.
I mean, I'm not surprised, but I didn't know
he later said, quote, we forced a joint session of Congress and the Vice President to evacuate because Trump supporters were banging down and then successfully burst through the doors. Fuentes was not the only provocateur to revel in the violence. According to Mike Dunn, a member of the Boogaloo Boys, an anti-government movement whose adherents helped to lead multiple groups in storming the Capitol, the Boogaloo Boys will be, quote, working overtime to capitalize on the January 6th riots and hope it will lead to more action. They said, quote, just know there's more to come.
And people try to defend the
Proud Boys members were bragging about the attack on the Capitol. One post on the Proud Boys Telegram channel said, people saw what we can do. They know what we're up to. They know and they want in. The leader of the Proud Boys himself sent the same message. Enrique Tarrio said the Proud Boys would be active during Biden's presidency. Tarrio stated, you're definitely going to see more of us.
Oh, yeah,
extremist groups are also boasting that the attack on our Capitol is a boon for their recruitment efforts. 3% security force leader Chris Hill says he's been contacted by several people interested in joining since the insurrection. And as one expert who focuses on domestic extreme measurable effects, this was a far-right extremist, one of the most successful attacks that they've ever launched. They're talking about this as the first stab in a greater revolution. And as indicated by Mr. Holt, their perceived success has given them encouragement to continue and to escalate attacks. Intelligence agencies have also noted that these extremist groups will, unfortunately, be targeting vulnerable minority communities in the U.S.
Oh, my God.
A January 27, 2021 DHS bulletin warned, quote, long-standing racial and ethnic tension of the sort that led to a man killing 23 people at an El Paso Walmart will continue to grow and motivate further attacks. The January 13 Joint Intelligence Bulletin report stated that in addition to the other types of violence listed, DVEs may be incited to carry out more violence, including violence against racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, and associated institutions, journalists, members of the LGBTQ+ community, and other targets common among some DVEs. These prejudiced elements could be seen visibly in the crowd that attacked the Capitol. Pictured here is Robert Packer. Robert Packer is an avowed white supremacist and Holocaust denier who proudly wore that sweatshirt which states, quote, Camp Auschwitz. These prejudiced elements could also be heard from the crowds.
That's so crazy.
As you've heard, The insurrectionists that attacked the Capitol on January 6th hurled racial slurs, including at black police officers. One officer described the trauma he experienced when the rioters seized the Capitol. He said, quote, "I'm a black officer. There was a lot of racism that day. I was called racial slurs, and in the moment, I didn't process this as traumatic. I was just trying to survive. I just wanted to get home, to see my daughter again. I couldn't show weakness. I finally reached a safe place, surrounded by officers. I was able to cry,
That's so wild.
to let it out, to attempt to process it." These extremist groups were emboldened because President Trump told them repeatedly that their insurrectionist activities were the pinnacle of patriotism. Well, let today be the day that we reclaim the definition of patriotism.
Nope.
Impeachment is not to punish, but to prevent. We are not here to punish Donald Trump. We are here to prevent the seeds of hatred that he planted from bearing any more fruit. As my colleague showed, this was not the first time that President Trump inspired violence, but it must be the last time that he's given a platform to do so.
Facts.
This must be our wake-up call. Roe has been a steadfast advocate for her daughter that people had rushed too quickly to reconciliation without accountability.
That's facts.
If you rush to heal, if you rush to everybody grab each other and sing Kumbaya, then we've accomplished nothing and we'll be right back here in a few years.
She was dead on. That's facts.
We will be right back
That was
here
big facts she
in a
was
few
speaking.
years. Those were her words in 2018, 3 years ago. Her daughter's murderer, he was held to account. But our nation did not impose any meaningful accountability on a president who at the time said that there were very fine people on both sides. And now where are we 3 years later? I'd argue we're not just back where we were. I would argue things are worse. In 2017, it was unfathomable to most of us to think that Charlottesville could happen, just as it was unfathomable to most of us that the Capitol could have been breached on January 6th. Frankly, what unfathomable horrors await us if we do not stand up now and say, no, this is not America? And we will not just express condolences and denunciations. We won't just close the book and try to move on. We will act to make sure this never happens again.
That was some heat. Let's see what more heat they got.
Representative Cicilline and Liu will now come to show the harm done and the damage done to Congress and our democratic process. Mr. Cicilline.
They've all
President,
had whole books full of heat.
distinguished senators,
The binder of heat.
you just heard from my colleague, Manager DeGette, how the conduct of Donald Trump dramatically increased the threats to our security and emboldened violent domestic extremists. I'd like to now turn to the harm that was caused here, inside these walls, as a result of the conduct on January 6th.
They got the cookbooks on.
The harm to us,
They
to
got
Congress,
They
to
got
those who
recipes
serve
for
our
this
country,
man. Straight recipes.
and to the constitutional processes as the Trump mob tried to stop the election certification process. The attack on January 6th was one of the bloodiest intrusions in the Capitol
Recipes, methods.
since
yep.
the British invaded in the
got
War of
methods.
1812 and burned it to the ground. And you've heard in painstaking detail that the president's mob posed an immediate and serious threat to the continuity and constitutional succession of the United States government. As the first, second, and third in line to the presidency, the vice president, the Speaker of the House, the president pro tem, were all together and faced a common threat in the same location. And we've seen the first and the second were purposely targeted by these attackers. These weren't idle threats. The mob, as you have heard, chanted, "Hang Mike Pence."
Hang Mike Pence! Hang Mike Pence! Hang Mike Pence! Hang Mike Pence!
The charging documents show that the rioters said they would have killed Vice President Pence and Speaker Pelosi had they found them. Dawn
so wild.
Bancroft and
You
Diane
just straight admit
Santos
that.
Smith, two of the rioters charged in the attack, were caught on tape discussing the brutal violence that they hoped to inflict on Speaker Pelosi had she not been rushed out to safety. They said, quote, "We broke into the Capitol. We got inside. We did our part. And we were looking for Nancy to shoot her in the frigging brain, but we didn't find her."
I said he was going to try to
End
shoot her
quote.
in the brain. You thought he was me. You thought he had
Senators,
the Mambo on deck.
Simply
My man
put,
thought he had Mambo
this
at the
mob
buzzer.
was trying to overthrow our government. And they came perilously close
I thought he had
to reaching
Mambo
the
at buzzer.
first three
Turns out
people
he
in
had
line to
Shaq
the
at free throw
presidency.
line.
It wasn't just the vice president and the speaker. Rioters were prepared to attack any member of Congress they found. Thomas Edward Caldwell, Donovan Ray Kroll, and Jessica Marie Watkins, three militia members, were also charged for their role in the attack. They discussed trapping us inside the underground tunnels. The indictment quotes social media chatter with Caldwell, quote, "All members are in the tunnel under Capitol. Seal them in.
Brain.
Turn on gas. All legislators are down in the tunnels, 3 floors down. Do like we had to do when I was in the Corps and start tearing out floors, go from top to bottom," end quote. Never did any of
That's
us
so scary,
imagine
dog.
that
People
we
in the
or our
Marine Corps.
colleagues would face mortal peril by a mob riled up by the President of the United States, the leader of the free world. But we did. All because Donald Trump could not accept his election defeat. Trump chose himself above the people, above our institutions, above our democracy, above all of you. You know, we've heard Trump espouse for years now this America First policy. But his true North Star isn't America's well-being. It's not country first like our dear departed colleague John McCain. No, his directive is Trump first, no matter the cost, no matter the threat to our democracy. But each and every one of us in this room must agree on one thing. We can never allow the kind of violent attack that occurred on January 6th to ever happen again in this country. In the immediate aftermath, we heard really disturbing accounts from many members of Congress about what they experienced that day. Here are some of those reactions. Following the attack, Representative Dusty Johnson expressed concerns that we had gotten to the point where so many of us had sown the seeds of anger and division.
We were barricaded, and there was some fear, to be sure, but overwhelmingly the emotion that I experienced was one of anger. I just could not believe that this was happening. I could not believe that we had gotten to this point where so many of us had sown these seeds of anger and of division, and we had built this powder keg. And really, we were starting to see this powder keg light up, and it was, frankly, I was furious.
Representative Jason Crow compared the events of this day to his time in Afghanistan as an Army Ranger, something Senator Reid knows something about.
What I felt in the Capitol behind us is something that I haven't felt since I was in Afghanistan as an Army Ranger. And to think that as a member of Congress in 2021, in the U.S. Capitol on the House floor, that I was preparing to fight my way out of the People's House against a mob is just beyond troubling.
Representative Pat Fallon was humbled by his experience on January 6th and described the events as surreal as they unfolded here in the Capitol.
It was something that I just never thought I'd see this in our nation's capital, and particularly in the House chamber. It was surreal when it was unfolding. Well, and what was interesting was the bravery and the courage of some of my fellow members. When we got to a point where the mob was banging on the doors, and all that kept them from reaching the chamber itself was the doors, and then some furniture that we had moved, and some Capitol Police, and they needed to be augmented. And so Tony Gonzalez, a new freshman rep from Texas, and Ronnie Jackson, and Troy Nels, and Mark Wayne Mullen stepped in, and we broke off furniture. Some of the hand sanitizer stations are on these big giant poles, wooden poles, and we turned them upside down, and we were ready to actually have the street fight in the House chamber. It was unbelievable.
That's so crazy. They're talking about fighting in the House chamber.
Many members that day wondered if they would ever see their families again. As the rioters breached the Capitol and they were outnumbered and trapped inside, they were calling loved ones to say goodbye. Representative Dan Kildee was one of them. Listen to how he described the impact of the riot on him.
I was laying on the floor, trying to, protect myself behind this little wall, and we all took our pins off because we're certain that if this mob were to come in, that would not be a good thing for them to quickly, easily be able to identify us as members of Congress. And I called my wife, and it wasn't until I heard her voice that I thought, wow, this is like one of those calls you hear about.
While most coverage is focused on the extreme danger posed to members and the Capitol Police who were targets of this attack, there were lots of other people in the Capitol working on January 6th as well. From personal aides to floor employees, cleaning staff, food service workers. We can't forget all the people that were in harm's way that day. These employees experienced trauma, some cowered, hiding in places just feet away from where this rabid crowd had assembled. Many were just kids, 20-somethings, who came here to work because they believed in their country and they believed in working to make it better. Others were dedicated food and service workers, all who work incredibly hard to make sure that we can come here and do our jobs. These workers are the lifeblood of the legislative branch. They deserved better. You've already heard from Speaker Pelosi's staff, the staff that was hiding under the conference table, cowering in the dark, making sure that the attackers couldn't hear them. But I'd like to share with you what some other staffers went through. Listen as two staffers recall what they experienced that day.
But then we were seeing on Twitter, on our phones, and then and hearing from some of the police officers on the floor that the building had been breached. Building breached, those were two words I had never heard.
That was particularly stressful, being in a room close to where things are happening and not really knowing what was happening, and seeing it come in live and getting texts from people, are you okay? And truthfully, I didn't know what was happening. I heard shots fired, shots fired, shots fired, show me your hands, show me your hands. Then I did not know if they were right outside, if they were lots of people with weapons, if there were one shooter, if they had, I didn't know what it looked like. I just knew that there were shots fired outside of the House chamber.
According to reports, one Republican Senate staffer whose office was not far from the floor, quote, took a steel rod and barricaded his door as the rioters banged on his door trying to break in. The New York Times also reported that a senior black staffer was under lockdown for 6 hours during the insurrection, was so disturbed about these events that she quit her job.
Straight quit.
Another staffer who was on the floor of the House that day described that what happened on January 6th still echoes in his mind. Listen to him describe the moments just before this indelible image.
I heard glass break, and I could see the window panes on the house main door start to pop. And I figured that, obviously I knew they were at the door, and they figured out a way to break the glass. And the last thing I remember before I walked off the floor was several of the police officers had drawn their guns and had their guns trained on the door. Clearly that was, I didn't think there was anything else I could do, and I didn't want to be there for whatever was about to occur. So I got to the top of the stairs. The stairway was pretty packed, and right about that point, I don't know whether it was a police officer or somebody else said, "They're right behind us, run." For me, the thing that I keep thinking about, and again, there isn't a day that hasn't gone by since January 6th that at some point in the day I haven't kind of gone back and picked at some little thing, but the sound of those window panes popping, I won't forget that sound.
I won't forget that sound. How long will the sound of window panes breaking haunt this staffer? And he isn't alone. There are countless people who are still living with the trauma of what happened that day.
Right.
This includes, by the way, another group of people who were with us in the Capitol on that day, and that's the press. They were in danger, particularly after years of being derided by President Trump as fake news. Kristen Wilson, a reporter for CNN, recently tweeted about her experience. She said, "I have 14 people on my team. We were scattered everywhere. 2 of them were on crutches and couldn't have run if they had to. They had to anyway. 1 was trapped in the House chamber and had to crawl out to hide. 4 of us barricaded ourselves in a room off the Senate chamber. Every bang on the door of them trying to come through, I can still hear in my head." The janitorial and custodial staff of the Capitol, the people who day after day tend to our home away from home, were also traumatized. But we don't talk about them and the harm they suffered often enough. One janitorial worker recounted how he was so scared that he had to hide in a closet during the attack. He said, quote, "I was all by myself. I didn't know what was going on," end quote. Another employee, a mother of 3, said, "The insurrection shattered all my sense of security at work." And an employee of the Capitol said, quote, "I hope nothing else happens, because these people were talking about killing us, killing federal employees, killing police." Another employee was afraid to work on Inauguration Day, said, quote, "I honestly fear for my life. I've got 2 children at home," end quote. For many of the black and brown staff, the trauma was made worse by the many painful symbols of hate that were on full display that day. Insurrectionists waved Confederate flags and hurled the most disgusting racial slurs at dedicated Capitol workers. Then after all of that, these same workers, many of them people of color, were forced to clean up the mess left by mobs of white nationalists. One member of the janitorial staff reflected how terrible he felt when he had to clean up feces that had been smeared on the wall, blood of a rioter who had died, and broken glass and other objects strewn all over the floor. He said, "I felt bad. I felt degraded." Let's also not forget that this violent attack happened in the middle of a global pandemic. Social distancing was impossible as we were hiding for our lives in cramped quarters for long periods of time.
Yeah, I would have quit too.
Since January 6th, at least 7 members who hid with other members of Congress have tested positive for COVID-19. At least 38 Capitol Police officers have either tested positive or been exposed. And nearly 200 National Guard troops who were deployed to our nation's capital to provide all of us protection have tested positive. The Capitol Police and the National Guard came here to keep us safe, to serve, and they put their lives in danger. They deserved better than this. We all did.
Thank you, Christian.
That brings me to the next harm. Now, all of us in this room made it out alive, but not everyone was so lucky. 3 law enforcement officers tragically lost their lives as a result of the riot on January 6th. These officers, Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, Capitol Police Officer Howard Liebengood, and Metropolitan Police Officer Jeffrey Smith all honorably served to protect and defend. My colleague, Mr. Swalwell, told you about Officer Sicknick. He was a 42-year-old military veteran who dedicated his entire life to public service. On January 6th, he fought a mob of rioters as they streamed into the Capitol and ultimately lost his life protecting us. Officer Liebengood was a 15-year veteran of the Capitol Police. His father served as Sergeant-at-Arms here in the Senate, and Officer Liebengood followed his extraordinary example of public service. Officer Smith served for 12 years with the Metropolitan Police Department. He heeded the call of duty on January 6th by coming to stand with the Capitol Police to help secure our democracy. Earlier, my colleague, Manager Swalwell, showed you terrible videos of the police being physically abused and injured. You remember what happened to Officer Fanone and Officer Hodges of the MPD, but there were scores of other officers whose names we don't know who were also brutalized that day. Injuries to the U.S. Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police Department include concussions, irritated lungs, serious injuries caused by repeated blows from bats, poles, and clubs. Capitol Police officers also sustained injuries that will be with them for the rest of their lives. One officer lost the tip of a right index finger.
Wow.
In a statement issued on January 7th, the chairman of the Capitol Police Officers Union said, and I quote, "I have officers who were not issued helmets prior to the attack, who have sustained brain injuries. One officer has 2 cracked ribs and 2 smashed spinal discs. One officer is going to lose his eye, and another was stabbed with a metal fence stake," end quote. In total, at least 81 members of Capitol Police and 65 members of the Metropolitan Police Department were injured during the attack on January 6th. Anything he'd seen in his 30-year career in law enforcement.
And it's crazy that people from this
DC
are
Police
out of
Chief
jail
Robert
already
J.
and have
Conti
been
III,
out for
who
like
had
a
spoken
week,
with an officer
where if
who
this
had
was a
been
Black Lives
beaten
Matter where
and
this shit
injured with
happened,
a stun
everybody
gun,
would be catching
said,
football
quote,
numbers, Fed charges.
"I've talked to officers who have done 2 tours in Iraq who said this was scarier to them than their time in combat."
They're not going to lock Trump up. They're not going to lock him up.
Of course, the
They're not even
physical
gonna convict
violence is not the only thing that will have a lasting effect
He's gonna run again
on
in
our brave
2024.
sworn officers. Trump's mob verbally denigrated their patriotism, questioned their loyalty, and yelled racial slurs. They called them traitors.
We feel like
Nazis,
they have to, but you got to remember that
un-American
the Republicans
for protecting
are like,
us. For example, in the next clip, a rioter wearing a hunting jacket accosts a police officer.
The Republicans live in a completely different world than we do. The Republicans think that these people are
Now, once again, America. Now, one idea. Don't touch me, don't. Get the fuck out of here. Don't touch me, motherfucker. Easy, man. Take it easy. No, they work for us. Fuck them.
Listen to how the Trump mob talked to these officers. You heard that with your own ears.
Fuck you! You're a fucking traitor! You come here, motherfucker! What's going on? You're a fucking traitor to your country! Yeah! You're a fucking traitor! Fucking traitor!
Effing traitor. So
Call
much
him
for
traitor.
Back in the Blue.
Right?
Just a couple more examples.
Out over your paycheck! Fuck you guys! You can't even call yourself American! You broke
That
your
man has
fucking
the
nose
spray
today.
on deck.
1776,
He has that spray
bitch!
ready. That man has the real mask on.
They called law enforcement officers traitors. You have to wonder, who are these rioters sworn to? To whom do they believe the police owe their loyalty? To the people? To the Constitution? To our democracy? Or to Donald Trump? Even those who were not outwardly injured, the mental toll has been significant. Several Capitol Police officers have reportedly threatened self-harm in the days following the riot.
Wild.
And in one case, an officer voluntarily turned in her gun because she was afraid of what might happen.
That's
Black
wild.
police officers were also met with racist vitriol. You heard lead manager Raskin reference a black police officer who, weary from racialized violence that he had experienced that day, saying, "Tears just started streaming down my face. I said, what the F, man? Is this America?"
Hell yeah, it is.
Is this America, lead manager
it is.
Raskin asked. Is this America?
It is.
What is your answer to that question? Is this okay? If not, what are we going to do about it? These people matter. These people who risk their lives for us. So I ask you respectfully to consider them, the police officers, the staff of this building, when you cast your vote. These people are in deep pain because they showed up here to serve the American people, to serve their government, to serve all of us. And I ask each of you, when you cast your vote, to remember them and honor them and act in
You're
service
not
of
going to
them
vote to convict him.
as they deserve. I also want to recognize that 4 individuals, 4 insurrectionists, who also lost their lives during the attack. These people were led here by the words and actions of an individual who made them believe that they were patriots. The loss of human life is, of course, the most consequential. But that was not the only damage wrought that day. The Trump
shit is so
mob
crazy.
also damaged this building. They defiled some of the most sacred places. Statuary Hall, the Rotunda, where some of America's greatest champions, presidents, Supreme Court justices, civil rights heroes, and other defenders are honored after their death. Trump's violent mob had little respect for this place. This video shows the wreckage left in the Senate parliamentarian's office by the insurrectionists.
This is crazy. Look at that. Destroyed that shit.
A bust of President Zachary Taylor was smeared with what appeared to be blood. An empty picture frame, presumably robbed of its contents, was found on the floor. And videos of the insurrection captured one man stealing a framed photo, another one tearing a scroll from the wall and ripping it up and throwing those pieces on the floor. A sign paying tribute to John Lewis was also shamefully destroyed, and only a broken piece of the memorial was found on the ground next to a trash can. The photo of Mr. Lewis was gone. The damage done to this building is a stain on all of us and on the dignity of our democracy. The attack we saw had a purpose: stop the certification, stop our democratic process. Fortunately, they did not prevail.
What's up, Christian Rivera?
Newspapers across America on January 21st, the day after the inauguration, proclaimed democracy has prevailed. President Biden said that in his inauguration speech. The headline was in so many places because the world's oldest constitutional democracy and the principles underlying it had been attacked and challenged. This wasn't just an attack on the Capitol building and the dedicated people inside. It was an attack on what we were elected to preserve, our democracy. This attack on our elections, on the peaceful transfer of power from one president to the next, didn't even happen during the Civil War. But it did just happen because of the cold, calculated, and conspiratorial acts of our former President, Donald J. Trump. We showed you that the insurrectionists were deliberate, that they came looking for Vice President Pence and Speaker Pelosi, ready to kill. When President Trump incited a lawless mob to attack our process, he was attacking our democracy. He was trying to become king and rule over us against the will of the people and the valid results of the election. For the first time ever in our history, a sitting president actively instigated his supporters to violently disrupt the process that provides for the peaceful transfer of power from one president to the next. Think about that for a moment. What if President Trump had been successful? What if he had succeeded in overturning the will of the people in our constitutional processes?
That's what I wonder, honestly.
Who among us
what would happen
is
next?
willing to risk that outcome by letting Trump's constitutional crimes go unanswered? The founders included impeachment in our Constitution not as a punishment, but to prevent. We have to prevent every president, today, tomorrow, or at any time in the future, from believing that this conduct is acceptable. Today, we have to stand up for our democracy and ensure we remain a country governed by the people, for the people, by telling Donald Trump and people all across this country and all across the world that his crimes will not and cannot stand.
Yeah, this is still going on, Janelle. I'm doing all right. Just a little tired. Didn't get much sleep. Had to wake up to clean off some snow off vehicles, but
The Senate will stand in recess.
I ask unanimous consent the House stand in recess for 15 minutes.
Without objection, the Senate will stand in recess.
they're taking a break, I guess. Oh, they're in recess. Are we about to hear the defense? Let's see what else we got going on. Let's check the news out. Let's go to NBC. Joe, thanks for the like.
Happened on January 6th at the Capitol, trying to put his fingerprints on it, essentially, and trying to make the point that it should come as no surprise based on his past behavior. Let's bring in NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd, and our chief Washington correspondent, Andrea Mitchell. Chuck, first to you. I feel like we're hearing things that we all knew, but maybe had not put together before in quite the way it's being presented here.
Based on how this goes.
That's correct. And look, I think this is actually both an important part of this presentation and perhaps the hardest part to persuade skeptical Republicans apart, and that is this idea of tying basically the entire Trump era, right? It didn't quite start with him going down the escalator, but it was pretty close. And look, I think it's a very compelling case they laid out about this was, he created the atmosphere that we've been living in under this, and this rise in violence is basically attributable to him. Now, that said, this is an argument that many have been making for some time, that this has been a slow build, that the president himself has basically been this instigator of the increased violence we've seen in politics over the last 5 years. And I will tell you, it is something that Republicans in the Senate get their back up the most about. Well, you could say some might say they're in denial about that, but there has always been more hesitance here. So I think it's an effective and persuasive argument to the public. I don't know if it's going to be persuasive to the 15 or 20 Republican senators that might be persuadable right now. They have avoided this line for years, Lester. They have been extremely uncomfortable in it, even though, ironically, one of the first Republican senators to bring up this idea that what Donald Trump was doing was creating an atmosphere of violence was Ted Cruz back in 2016.
Wow.
And he said it quite clearly and worried that there was going to be violence at the Republican convention by Trump supporters. So now I don't think that version of Ted Cruz now of today would not necessarily say the same thing. So it has been a difficult case to get Republicans to accept the idea of this has been a 5-year campaign. I found it persuasive, but I'm not sure it will be persuasive in that change.
Frankly, I had forgotten about a lot of those moments at the rallies where Donald Trump and candidate Donald Trump seemed to be provoking this idea of his supporters lashing out at people who had interrupted or had protested his rallies. Let me turn to Andrea right now. Andrea, what did you take away from this point in the trial and the points they're trying to make?
Well, I think that they are arguing for history and they're arguing for the American people, because I don't think that they believe that they can win a conviction. But at the same time, showing all of those incidents, as you say, and most recently, besides the election and Stop the Steal and all of that, the post-election Donald Trump, but going back to the attack on the Michigan Capitol, the Trump tweets calling on liberating Minnesota, liberate Virginia, liberate Michigan after the COVID restrictions, all of that prompting, in all caps, that urging protest against Michigan, in particular, Governor Whitmer, who then, of course, led to the indictment on charges of attempted kidnapping and threats to her life for that attack last April in the capital of Michigan. So all of that leads up to what Chuck is now describing. Also, that he has not shown remorse. What he did during and after, and it's particularly urging them on, not calling them out, not calling them down, but in fact tweeting and also targeting Mike Pence. I think they have very effectively shown that he was targeting his very loyal vice president. So that's the way they're making this case. And then finally, what you just saw, the visual evidence of the way they attacked the police officers, calling them, effing traitors and Nazis. That was so visceral, and it is connected because they were repeating a lot of the things that Donald Trump had said at the rally from the evidence that had previously been
I'll show you some pictures really quick.
Presented, showing visually that it was, go to the Hill and stop the steal, and they've stolen this election. All of that persuading this mob that they were doing it for the president. As I say, it remains to be seen whether that is persuasive to 17 Republican senators.
Yeah, and that's the ultimate question, Andrea. Among those hearing today's presentation is Senator Mark Warner, Democrat of Virginia. Senator, good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Sir, thank you.
I first want to get your thoughts on Lindsey Graham's tweet of earlier saying that the group of not guilty votes seems to be growing, and commenting on yesterday's rather graphic video saying it was offensive and absurd. What is your take on some of your colleagues on the other side of the aisle and whether they may be moving on this?
I'm not going to comment on any specific tweet. I am going to say yesterday was extraordinarily emotional as somebody who lived through January 6th. When we saw those mobs rampaging through, I thought I'd kind of gotten that through my system. Today, I felt again the notions of how the law enforcement officers were abused, how our Capitol was desecrated. I live close. I'm from Virginia, so I was in the Capitol the next day and saw the destruction, saw how it had been turned into an armed camp.
Pictures from the Super Bowl.
How anybody can say that
in Tampa.
That's okay.
The Super Bowl.
That somehow this happened not because of Donald Trump. I mean, no one could make the case legitimately that but for Donald Trump's actions that any of this kind of vandalism, insurrection would have taken place. So,
and of course,
every individual colleague has got to live not only in the immediate next week or 2 weeks, what may be in their short-term political benefit, but how they're going to live with themselves for literally
restaurants
years
and bars and stuff have
decades to come.
And of course, beginning tomorrow, the president's lawyers will in fact make the case that there is no connection between what he said and what occurred there. if not enough votes occur, if in fact the former president is found not guilty, what does that say about the state of the country, the state of Democrats, state of Republicans?
Tom
Says about
Brady
state of
is
Democrats,
faded.
Republicans. I think I hope
Brady
that every
was lit.
American,
Fuck Tom
supporters
Brady,
of
but he was
74 million Americans who supported Mr. Trump, I hope they're watching this. I hope they will make their own judgment in their heart whether they think this is
Straight tossing
acceptable
the Lombardi
behavior,
trophy
whether
in
future
the water,
presidents, I don't care which
Coulda had
political
that joint
party,
lost
that this kind of behavior is going to be okay, that we can somehow turn the page and not hold those responsible, accountable. That's not who I think we are as a country. That's not what we are as a democracy, rule of law. We all pay, hopefully, more than lip service to these terms. But at least the 100 of us who are currently sitting in judgment will get a chance to go on the record in a few days. And that record will last longer than the next fundraising support report or the next election cycle. We will go down in history making a judgment of whether this kind of activity and action is acceptable, not just for Donald Trump, but somehow if it's okay for one person to do it, well, maybe it's okay for somebody else. That's not the kind of country that I think we are, and at the end of the day, not the kind of country that I hope the vast majority of my colleagues will want to endorse.
There will always be those who look at this through a political lens, that this is going after the guy you've been going after for 4 years on his way out the door. How do you think the House managers have done in terms of navigating around the idea that this is some political vendetta, that it's something more than that?
Well, the nature of impeachment, we all know, has politics to it. But I think they've generally done a pretty good job. They've not come in shrill. They've not come in with the same kind of heat that maybe took place in the first impeachment. And I think putting up
it doesn't
videos
matter, though.
Republican House
are dummy
members,
partisan.
Republican governors,
They don't care.
of Trump officials. And they posted the
legitimately
16
seriously do not
that resigned. I know, and I worked very closely with a number of people in the Trump administration, senior
Trump said
officials.
himself he could
were
shoot someone in the
friends.
brain
I
on
remember
Fifth
very
Ave, and he
personal
would still get votes.
conversations I had with them in the aftermath of January 6th, whether they were going to resign as well, because there was no way anyone with a sense of decency, with a sense of any kind of responsibility, could somehow excuse the behavior that took place on January 6th. And the idea that somehow there was no direct linear connection between Trump's big lie, his failure to accept the fact that he was a loser, a big-time loser, 7 million plus votes differential, bringing then his supporters, and his willingness to sacrifice anything in terms of respect for rule of law, or sacrifice his own vice president to try to continue this failed attempt to stop the count. I don't think there's candidly even any of my Republican colleagues who may try to hide behind some constitutional argument of you can't impeach somebody who's already left office. But I don't know if any of them in their heart really believes that somehow Trump was not responsible for what happened on January 6th.
All right. Well, Senator Warner, thank you for taking up some of your break time with us. We appreciate it, sir.
Thank you.
Casey Hunt is on Capitol Hill for us. Casey, I know you have a better insight as to where all this is going, what the schedule now appears to be.
Sure, Lester, and I was listening to your conversation just there with Senator Warner with great interest, because we do expect, of course, that the defense, former President Trump's defense, is only going to take a day of their time, and that we may see this trial start to accelerate. And the point that Chuck was making earlier about the slightly more political nature of the presentation today, I think is one that you can sense up here on Capitol Hill. That yesterday, as all of that new audio and video was played and shown, everyone was reliving that moment. And now there seems to be a point where everyone is taking a little bit of a breath and settling in to their respective political camps. And Warner, I think, captured a dynamic that we all know has been happening behind the scenes. And I'd put it like this. What would the difference be if this vote were actually held on a secret ballot and not in public? I think the general consensus is, certainly among the sources that I talked to, is that there would be many more Republicans who would be willing to say, yes, this was President Trump's responsibility in some form or fashion.
They need 67
in
votes
private,
to convict.
than they are willing to say
no
in
way.
public. And
There's
there
no
are a lot of
fucking way.
political reasons for that. The members of the chamber who are running for president in 2024 as Republicans,
Yeah,
or
I
who
feel
we
the same
expect to
way,
run
Chanel. Like,
for president,
I'm a
people like
musician,
Josh
you know what
Hawley,
I mean?
perhaps
Like,
Ted Cruz.
I miss
If
the
they want to
bar
win the
scene
Republican
and all that
nomination, they
stuff.
can't
As much
alienate
as I
former
hate-
President
'cause I don't
Trump's
drink
supporters.
anymore,
That's
and I
their
find
reality.
drunk
But for
people
senators who are thinking longer term, and this is
extraordinarily
why Mitch
that
McConnell's
aspect
decision
of it I
here
don't
is going to be
miss,
so
for sure.
interesting.
But I do miss
and
playing
what
music,
the
seeing
way that in
music.
which he is thinking
I
about
miss
the
movie
future of the
theaters,
party, of the
for sure.
Senate itself,
I miss
of the country,
arcades.
is
There
that
was a
he
nice
is thinking
arcade
about,
not far
okay,
from
how
where
are we
I
going
live that I
to win a
obviously
majority in the Senate? How are
can't
we going
and
to
don't go to
eventually
anymore.
be trusted again to govern from the White
But
House?
it's gotta be
and
safe.
the answer to that likely
Both
does
my
not
parents
lie
had
with
COVID.
Donald
One of my
Trump,
mom's
because
close friends
it's important to
is
recognize that while Donald
intubated,
Trump
has tubes all in his
insisted
throat
that
and
he
shit
didn't lose,
right now from
in
COVID.
reality, he did.
Like,
he lost the Senate, he lost the White House
crazy.
For Republicans,
All because
and of
people
course,
wanted to go to Red
Democrats
Lobster
also
with no
control
mask
the
on.
House of Representatives. And for somebody like McConnell, what happened on January 6th was in many ways the culmination of all of these forces and evidence that America really is rejecting what happened on the 6th is the worst form of what they are rejecting, but there have been many other points along the way. What happened in Charlottesville, for example, that was a big part of this. So now it's going to be up to these Republicans to decide what do they want history to record here. And I think we have seen time and time again that they have put the short-term political calculation ahead of whatever they may feel privately about former President Trump. And I don't think that there necessarily are going to be many more Republicans who decide to vote to convict in the wake of this. But there is this underlying reality here still that there is the incredible discomfort. And as we look ahead here, I think we're going to likely hear an emotional closing argument eventually from Jamie Raskin, the lead impeachment manager, who has done so much in telling his personal story here. And then the Trump defense also has a pretty tough hill to climb, considering their previous performance. So
I guess we're about to hear
there are
defense.
still some questions about how this is all going to play out, but it definitely feels here as though we are kind of on the other side of the most intense, most emotional moment in the trial, that if there were going to be minds changed, that was going to be when it happened, Lester.
Okay, Casey, thank you. I want to bring in senior Washington correspondent Hallie
Thanks,
Jackson.
Scott.
Hallie, what do we know about how this is being viewed by the defense team and about the former president's inner circle?
Well, a lot more than we did just a couple of hours ago when the House managers began to make their case, Lester. So a couple of highlights for you here. First, on the timing of this, I was speaking with one of the former president's advisors who suggested that, yes, the defense team will present and wrap up their arguments tomorrow, finishing probably
so
earlier
defense is
rather
tomorrow.
than later on Friday evening, leaving time potentially for the next phase of the trial to start, which would be the Senate Q&A. That's obviously not up to the defense team. I leave it to our Hill colleagues to determine the timing piece of that. But it is an indication that they want to get this done rather quickly. And that was reflected, Lester, by something else that was interesting that happened in the last couple of hours. As the members of the House impeachment prosecution team was presenting their case, the former president's top attorney, David Schoen, was not actually in the chamber. He had stepped out. He went to a different area in the Capitol complex to do a cable news hit. And on Fox News, David Schoen described what was happening in the impeachment process as offensive, he called it. He described it as an entertainment show by Democrats. And he did suggest and very explicitly say that they don't see a need to, in essence, drag this out any longer. That is why you're seeing an acceleration. We expect that
That's
tomorrow
so crazy.
from the former president's
so
defense.
crazy.
Casey alluded to this.
I told you.
Widespread
I
displeasure
fucking told
with
you.
the very
I
first
told
time
you.
that we saw the
They
former
are
president's
not going to
defense team,
convince Donald
specifically
Trump.
Bruce
They are
Castor,
not going
and
to
what
convict
many
this man.
derided
He is
as a
going to do this
meandering
again.
and rambling opening statement on behalf of the defense. Schoen, unsurprisingly, defended his colleague, suggested he'd been unfairly maligned, and said you will see a more sort of comprehensive, organized, structural presentation from the defense when that happens. They're going to hit at a couple of things, Lester. One word that we keep hearing from those defending the former president president is hypocrisy. The Democrats, in their view, are acting in a hypocritical way. You will see that argument made. And then there's another piece of the argument that's starting to bubble up from some conservatives whose names you know. So Karl Rove, for example, top Republican strategist, Senator Ted Cruz, making the argument that Democrats are failing to prove the legal bar for incitement, right, which is a sort of technical term in the legal sense, and that is not, in fact, what the Democrats are doing. So some of the former president's defenders, while even acknowledging, as Rove did, that what we have seen as far as the imagery is compelling, particularly with yesterday's emotional and powerful footage.
Yeah, it can be pretty
the sort of legal piece of this is perhaps not where some of these Senate Republicans want it to be. There was also a moment, Lester, that I think is worth noting here, and it came from Congressman Ted Lieu. When you heard him talking about connecting the dots, if you will, between the insurrectionists and what the Democrats are arguing is Donald Trump's incitement of them. And he talked about sort of the political future of the former president, if you will, and what is really at stake here. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing, his concern is not whether Donald Trump runs again, as our reporting has been, and my sources have said Donald Trump had been considering, but what happens if Donald Trump runs again and loses? And Congressman Lieu is trying to paint a very direct picture to perhaps some of those Senate Republicans who may be somewhat on the fence after what they saw yesterday, that if you do not convict, they're trying to say, and use this strategy, if you don't convict, this could happen again. And that sets the stakes at what's at play here, Lester.
Yeah, I thought that I honed in on that. Well, I thought that was an interesting way he put that and dealing with kind of the larger question of how people view this trial. I want to go to Chief White House Correspondent Kristen Welker right now. Kristen, we know the President Biden, has not been forthcoming with a lot of comments about this, but he did talk today. What did he say?
He did, Lester. It was significant for the first time, President Biden weighing in on what's happening on Capitol Hill. This happened when he was meeting with a bipartisan group of senators in the Oval Office. I was in there with him, and I asked him the question, what was his reaction to that video that was played yesterday by House managers? The president said he did not see it in real time, but that he had watched news coverage of it. And the president said he believes it's possible that minds could be changed, although he's not certain that that will happen. I then tried to press him. Does he then think that it is more likely that former President Trump could be convicted? And he didn't engage on that question, Lester. I tried to follow up with his press secretary during the daily briefing, Jen Psaki, and put that question to her. She said, look, the bottom line is the president was responding from an emotional standpoint. He found the video to be deeply disturbing, she said, and harrowing, but that he's not going to weigh in on whether or not his predecessor should be convicted. This has been the strategy from President Biden. He wants to show that he's focused on the agenda, getting his COVID relief package passed today, talking about infrastructure. He's going to be traveling to the National Institute of Health a little bit later on today, talking about the fight against COVID. But the question becomes, could this strategy potentially backfire? Because the nation is focused on this and on the critical questions that are being raised about the nation's democracy in this trial. It is not something that we should rule out, that we might hear from him at some point once this is all finished. Will he, for example, Lester, talk about the need to unify in the wake of this? That's undoubtedly among the conversations that are happening behind the scenes here at the White House, because remember, that was a key part of his agenda, what he ran on. He said that his number one priority was, yes, to fight COVID, to bring back the economy, but to try to unify the country, because he tried to make the case as a candidate. None of that would be possible if the country doesn't come together. So a significant day here at the White House with President Biden weighing in for the first time on what's happening on Capitol Hill, but so far not going so far as to say what he thinks ultimately the conclusion will be.
All right, Kristen Welker at the White House. Thanks. Also with us today, NBC News legal analyst Paul Butler, a Georgetown law professor and former federal prosecutor, and NBC News legal analyst Carol Lamb, a former U.S. attorney. Good to have both of you here. Carol, first of all, let's go back to Hallie a moment ago was ticking off the likely defenses we'll hear. One of them is this question of the bar of inciting. What exactly is it, and how does it fit in this trial?
Well, of course, there's a legal definition of incitement, and that means that there has to be imminent unlawful action when you utter your words with the intention of bringing about that imminent unlawful action. Again, we've said this many, many times. This is not a criminal proceeding. This is an impeachment, a political process. And so there are a lot of other considerations that come into play. And I think that one of the most striking things that we saw today with respect to the emphasis on the president's post-attack conduct, I think is very important for two reasons. The first reason is purely evidentiary. What post-attack conduct does is it turns a light on and it shines it on the pre-attack conduct of the president, and it gives insight into what his intent is. And what it shows is that post-attack, the president not only did nothing to condemn the violence, but he didn't even seem to understand why he should condemn the violence. And that means there were no holds barred in his conduct pre-attack. So from an evidentiary point of view, that was relevant. The other reason it's very important is because this entire morning was basically spent as impeaching the president's conduct and character. And that's important because the one purpose remaining on the table to this impeachment is a bar to holding future office. And what the House impeachment managers are saying is, because the president does not appreciate what he did wrong, there's nothing to keep him from doing it again. So everything we heard this morning was actually extremely relevant.
Yeah, and Paul, keeping in mind this is an impeachment, it's a political process. Talk about the idea of bringing past acts into a case like this. By that, I mean, we saw the clips of Donald Trump as a candidate urging his supporters to physically turn on people who interrupted or protested. We heard his remarks about Michigan Governor Whitmer. Typically, how much of that stuff is allowed in a trial, your past behavior in terms of whether you did this or not?
It wouldn't be allowed in most trials, but again, this isn't a formal criminal proceeding. This is a quasi-criminal and quasi-political proceeding, and that evidence is all about intent. Congressman Raskin examined the former president's history of inflammatory statements and how it served to actually incite violence in places like Michigan. So the argument is that the inflammatory statements were what were called road tests for what happened on January 6th. The idea is that the insurrection was so foreseeable that Trump must have known that his words would ignite criminal conduct. And so when he spoke at that rally, the House managers say that he was throwing fuel on a fire that was already burning. Again, if it were a criminal case, that evidence of intent would be required. It's not now. What the House prosecutors are hoping is that the circumstantial evidence will be enough to prove that Trump is blameworthy and he should be convicted.
All right, Paul and Carol, thanks to both of you. Let me turn now to NBC News political analyst and former Democratic Missouri Senator Claire McCaskill, and NBC News political analyst and editor of the National Review, Rich Lowry. Claire, first to you. Going into all this, there was the question of whether this was the politically appropriate thing for Democrats to pursue. Now that we're in day 3, seeing the evidence you've seen, do you feel this vindicates the importance of conducting this trial, even though it could quite possibly end up in a not guilty verdict?
Regardless of what happens, history needed this trial. I think it needed to be laid out in the detail and the granular nature of the evidence needed to come before the American people. I think years from now, this will be talked about. It was particularly powerful to understand how these police officers were treated, that over 80 of them were injured, and of course, obviously, one of them was murdered. It is powerful stuff, and I think it's important that it be done. I think it remains to be seen whether or not the president's failure to act will be the linchpin of their case. He could have saved that life and saved a lot of injuries had he called off the mob hours earlier than when he finally said go home. And I think that's what they've underlined. And Lester, I think this afternoon you're still going to see them preview the defense, which is going to be whataboutism. they're going to try to show riots in Portland and try to say there's no difference. But I don't think there's an equivalence there, and I don't think the American people will think so either.
Yeah, and Rich, we've heard the accusations of hypocrisy already in this sense of whataboutism.
Yeah, Donald, that's what I've been saying.
That will be
he
enough
should absolutely be convicted.
Some Republicans
1000%,
to hang their hat on, even though that they realize it might be a risky proposition?
Partially because that would
I
be
think they're hanging their hat on whatever they can get, Lester. I think there are two metrics by which we can look at the last couple of days and how effective the House managers have been. One is the metric, well, are they going to get 17 Republicans to convict? And by that metric, they're failing, and there's no way they could possibly succeed because people are just dug in on this. You're probably going to get 5 Republican votes to convict, maybe one more, maybe one less, but I would expect 5 no matter what happens. No matter what's happened to this point or what happens the rest of the trial. Then there's the other metric, which is just public persuasion. And that involves the question, are they making this more difficult rather than easier politically for Republicans to vote to acquit? Now, on that metric, I think the last couple of days have been a success. And a lot of these videos, the ones yesterday in particular, they don't really go to what the key question is at the trial, which is the president's culpability for what happened at the Capitol. But they certainly make a very emotive and memorable case that what happened at the Capitol was horrific and was a disgrace. So it's politically powerful. I don't think it's necessarily that powerful going to the merits of what this trial is about. But at the end of the day, the question here is not whether he's going to be found guilty or acquitted. He's definitely going to be acquitted.
What did you make of, I think it was Congressman Liu, his comment that it's not Donald Trump winning again that concerns him, but him losing again? Is that a concern you think shared by some of the Republicans in those chambers?
I think everyone, to a man or a woman, believes privately, no matter how forthrightly they are about it, that the way the president conducted himself was disgraceful. He was totally selfish. The beginning of the night of the election, when he said he'd won, it was being stolen from him. And given what he's about and how selfish he is, he would do it again if it came to that 4 years from now. Now, that's an awfully long time from now. But Lester, on the other side of the ledger, every Republican in that chamber knows that Republican voters, they might have been taken aback the first 3 days or so after this riot, thought about abandoning the president. But at the end of the day, the average Republican voter, their verdict on this impeachment trial is you better not convict. No, 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 don't even think about it. So that's why you only have a handful of Republicans, some of whom have different constituencies, some of whom just don't care, some of whom aren't running again, who will make up those 4 or 5 or 6 Republican votes to convict.
You make an interesting point, and let me bring Claire back in on that, this idea. How important is the jury of public opinion in a case like this?
Thanks, Donald. I appreciate you.
I think it's very important. And majorities are made on the margins, Lester. They're not made in bright red places and bright blue places. And I can assure you on the margins, this is hurting the Republican Party. And I do think that that's what Mitch McConnell has on his mind, whether it's fundraising and the difficulties this presents going forward. The question for history will be, was Donald Trump the face of the Republican Party, or will he become a Joe McCarthy as time goes on? Will he be someone that the Republican Party tries to distance themselves from? I think the jury is definitely still out on that one.
Yeah, and that's a good point to bring Chuck Todd in this, because, Chuck, you've talked about the fact that this is going to be a defining moment on whose party is this.
Well, and I think there's it's interesting. I've heard this debate, and I'm curious of Rich's opinion on this. I've heard this debate among some Republican senators, very quietly, who've said, hey, convicting him will make him a martyr. Well, what does acquitting him do? Does acquitting him give him more power or give him more perceived power? And so I think that you can take that argument about fear of making him a martyr and making him more powerful by convicting him. You could easily see the flip side of this, and in fact, 2 years from now, them going, oh, what have we done? We had a chance and we didn't do it. So, Rich, I'm curious. I got to think some of them are thinking about that by acquitting him, he wins this one. Well, then what? Nothing can disslay him. How does that not make him stronger instead of weaker?
Yeah, I just don't think conviction was ever really in the cards. And I've talked a lot to people in the Senate in this over the last month or so about this, some of whom are very anti-Trump, and almost all of them just think it was a mistake, just in sheer political terms, in terms of the health of the Republican Party, to go down this road, because it's going to elevate the president again. It's going to make him a martyr one way or the other. And this is not the way to kind of open up non-Trump space in the party. Now, that's, there are other considerations whether you impeachment have a trial or not, but just in sheer political terms, in terms of marginalizing Trump, I don't think any Republicans think this helps.
Hallie Jackson is joining us now. Hallie, what do we know about 2024 and whether it's something that would even be in the cards for Donald Trump, assuming that he's acquitted here?
Yeah, I mean, he may talk about it being in the cards. I do think it is notable we have not heard anything from former President Trump. Yes, he is banned from Twitter. He does not have his social media accounts, but that certainly does not preclude somebody with a platform like his from calling a preferred cable host, for example, or calling in to Mar-a-Lago where he's staying, reporters that have gathered in Palm Beach during this trial. He is staying quiet. And based on my reporting, it is largely because there are those around him who have been telling him, you don't need to, right? To Rich's point, the sense from Republicans, and obviously this is not a done deal until it's a done deal, but the sense from some Republicans I've been talking to is that they are on the path to acquittal here, unless Donald Trump, for lack of a better phrase, gets in his own way on this. So those around him are trying to not let him get in his own way to a degree. I think as it relates to his political future, it is something he's talked about, doing another presidential run. He's mused about it to aides and allies. I will tell you, though, that with sources that I talk to in sort of the Republican world, there's a sense that he will talk about it, but there's a real question mark of whether he will actually follow through with it, or whether he just likes and prefers that kind of threat, if you will, or possibility to be out there. Post January 6th, however, after January 6th, there was a real sense that he is almost unelectable from some. And I think that you heard that very explicitly from Senator Lisa Murkowski, who sort of plainly said, I just don't see how he could win again, right? There's been this argument that had come up a couple of weeks ago about you've got to be able to convict him so that you can move forward, from Democrats to be able to say convict, then move forward, bar him from ever running again. And there are some Republicans who believe that Donald Trump essentially did that to himself with the behavior that's being laid out from January 6th, Lester.
All right, let me bring Andrea Mitchell into the conversation. Andrea, we haven't talked a lot about Mitch McConnell. We heard Rich Lowry a moment ago say that the Republican votes certainly aren't there for conviction. But how large does McConnell still loom in all this?
Well, he is as ambiguous as ever. He's been pretty Sphinx-like, saying that he is not going to signal one way or the other. And that has led to so much speculation, especially from some of the leaks earlier to the New York Times and other news media, that he might even be willing to consider a conviction. I think Mitch McConnell wants to hold the Republican Party together. And he certainly would love to recapture the majority in 2 years. And that's not outside the realm of possibility with all of the problems that the new administration faces. Things could go badly, and it's a obviously very close margin at a 50-50 Senate. So that would be his chief goal, and to pick up more seats in the House.
Andrea,
so that's what he's got his end.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think we're back in session. Let's go back into the chambers.
The harm visited upon America's national security by these events and the damage to our international reputation.
My colleagues discussed with you the many harms to our nation as a result of President Trump's conduct. Now, I'd like to spend some time talking about the harm to our national security and our standing in the world. On January 6th, when President Trump incited a mob to march to the Capitol, he led them to a building that houses some of our nation's most sensitive information. And consider who was part of that mob. Some of the individuals were on the FBI watch list. The past behavior of some individuals led here by President Trump so alarmed investigators that their names had been added to the National Terrorist Screening Database. And at least one of the insurrectionists may have intended to steal information and give it to a foreign adversary. According to charging documents, Riley Williams allegedly helped steal a laptop from Speaker Pelosi to, quote, send the computer device to a friend in Russia who then planned to sell the device to SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service.
That's so crazy.
While we can't be certain if or how many foreign spies infiltrated the crowd, or at least coordinated with those who did, we can be sure that any enemy who wanted access to our secrets would have wanted to be part of that mob inside these halls.
Right.
And the point is this. Many of the insurrectionists that President Trump incited to invade this chamber were dangerous. People on the FBI watch list, violent extremists, white supremacists. And these insurrectionists, incited by President Trump, threatened our national security. Stealing laptops again from Speaker Pelosi's office, taking documents from Leader McConnell's desk, snapping photographs, as you saw in the videos earlier, in sensitive areas, ransacking your offices, rifling through your desks. The President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, knew the risk of anyone breaching the Capitol. He swore an oath to preserve, protect, and defend this country. And yet, he incited them here to break into the Capitol. Senators, as you all know, we have spent trillions of dollars building the strongest military in the world and billions of dollars on the most sophisticated weaponry on the planet to prevent the kind of attack that occurred at this Capitol on January 6th. And here's what the insurrectionists incited by President Trump did.
Hey, let's take a seat, people! Let's take a seat! Hey, Nancy Pelosi. Let's vote on some shit!
Oh my God, we did this shit. We took this shit.
I want to just get a snap of that.
Yeah, I took a picture.
In many ways, this room is sacred, and so are the traditions that it represents. They've been carried on for centuries. Congress has declared war 11 times on this floor, including entering World War II. And Congress passed the Civil Rights Act and expanded the right to vote to ensure that no matter your race or your gender, you have a voice in our nation. And this floor is where history has been made. And now, our intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies have the burden to figure out exactly what was stolen, taken, ransacked, and compromised. As acting U.S. Attorney Michael Sherwin explained, quote, materials were stolen, and we have to identify what was done, mitigate that, and it could have potential national security equities. These investigations are necessary now because of the actions of President Trump. And it wasn't just the people that he led here the intelligence agencies have to look into. It's also what they took and what they gathered. And it was the very fact that this building, with so much sensitive information and some classified information, that this Capitol was breached. And think about it. Every foreign adversary considering attacking this building got to watch a dress rehearsal, and they saw that this Capitol could be overtaken. As Elizabeth Newman, a former Trump administration official, stated, quote, "You have terrorists who would love to destroy the Capitol. They just saw how easy it was to penetrate."
That's so crazy.
We just exposed a huge vulnerability. And it's not just the Capitol. This attack has implications for all government buildings. And Senator Rubio made this point well.
If you're a terrorist right now and you're sitting out there watching this, you're saying to yourself, hey, it's not that hard to get into the Capitol. Maybe that's not hard to get into the White House or the Supreme Court building or somewhere else.
Our government our intelligence agencies, and our law enforcement have implemented additional safety measures since the attack on January 6th. But while we secure this physical space, what message will we send the rest of the world? We already know that the message our adversaries took from January 6th. This is how some of them responded after the attack. Quote, "For America's adversaries, there was no greater proof of the fallibility of Western democracy than the sight of the U.S. Capitol shrouded in smoke and besieged by a mob whipped up by their unwillingly outgoing president." And to make matters worse, our adversaries are even using the events of January 6th not only to denigrate America, but to justify their own anti-democratic behavior, calling America hypocritical. Here's what the Chinese government is saying. The spokesperson for China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said the Capitol riot should spark, quote, "deep reflection among U.S. lawmakers regarding how they discuss the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, suggesting that the U.S. is hypocritical in denouncing Beijing's crackdown in the city while it struggles with its own unrest at home." And the Global Times, an outlet affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party, even tweeted a series of side-by-side photos of two events: the siege of the U.S. Capitol and a July 2019 incident in which pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong broke into the city's Legislative Council building. Think about that.
Wild.
President Trump gave the Chinese government an opening to create a false equivalency between Hong Kongers protesting for democracy and violent insurrectionists trying to overthrow it. As Representative Gallagher described in real time,
and we
China
don't think
did
other
cook us.
countries around the world
China cooked us.
are watching this happen right now. If we don't think the Chinese Communist Party is sitting back and laughing, then we're deluding ourselves. So call it off, Mr. President. We need you to call this off.
Russia has also seized on this violent attack against our government, decrying that democracy is, quote, over. The chairman of the Russian Upper House of Parliament's International Affairs Committee said, quote, "The celebration of democracy is over. This is, alas, actually the bottom. I say this without a hint of gloating. America is no longer charting the course and therefore has lost all its rights to set it, and especially to impose it on others."
Damn, Russia cooked us.
They're
Russia
using
cooked us.
President Trump's incitement of an insurrection to declare that democracy is over. In Iran, the supreme leader is using President Trump's incitement of insurrection to mock America. He said of the situation in the United States, quote, "This is their democracy and human rights. This is their election scandal. These are their values. These values are being mocked by the whole world. Even their friends are laughing at them."
Damn.
These statements are serious and pervasive. And according to a joint threat assessment bulletin from the Department of Homeland Security, the
I didn't
FBI,
realize that they were cooking
and
us
8
like
other
this.
law enforcement
I wasn't
entities,
paying attention.
quote,
We are getting
"Since
cooked,
the
yo.
incident at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, Russian, Iranian, and Chinese influence actors have seized the opportunity to amplify narratives in furtherance of their policy interests amid the presidential transition." We cannot let them use what happened on January 6th to define us, who we are, and what we stand for.
This is why I hate liberals, yo.
We get to define ourselves by how we respond to the attack of January 6th. And some might be tempted
for
to
a big
say,
surprise when he gets away with it
point
and does it
out
again.
that our adversaries are always going to be critical of the United States.
So stupid.
But following the insurrection on January 6th, even our allies are speaking up. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said, quote, "What we witnessed was an assault on democracy by violent rioters, incited by the current president and other politicians. As shocking, deeply disturbing, and frankly saddening as that event remains, we have also seen this week that democracy is resilient in America, our closest ally and neighbor." The German foreign minister said, quote, "This closing of ranks begins with holding those accountable who are responsible for such escalations."
Facts.
That includes the violent rioters, and it also includes their instigators. The world is watching and wondering whether we are who we say we are. Because when our other countries have known chaos, our Constitution has helped keep order in America. This is why we have a Constitution. We must stand up for the rule of law, because the rule of law doesn't just stand up by itself. After the insurrection, my colleagues on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the chairman and the ranking member, issued a bipartisan statement that said, quote, "America has always been a beacon of freedom to the world, proof that free and fair elections are achievable and that democracy works. But what happened at the Capitol today has scarred our reputation and has damaged our standing in the world. Today's violence, an inevitable result when leaders in positions of power misled the public, will certainly empower dictators and damage struggling democracies." And that's true. For generations, the United States has been a North Star in the world for freedom, democracy, and human rights, because America is not only a nation, for many, it's also an idea. It's the light that gives hope to people struggling for democracy in autocratic regimes, the light that inspires people fighting across the world for fundamental human rights, and the light that inspires us to believe in something larger than ourselves. And this trial is an opportunity to respond and to send a message back to the world. And I say this as somebody who loves my country, our country, just as all of you do. There is a lot of courage in this room, a lot of courage that has been demonstrated in the lives of the people in this room. Some folks have stood up for the civil rights of fellow Americans and risked their careers and their reputations, their livelihoods, and their safety, standing up for civil rights. Many members of Congress have risked their lives in service to our country, in uniform, fighting in the jungles of Vietnam, patrolling the mountains of Afghanistan. You served our country because you were willing to sacrifice to defend our nation as we know it and as the world knows it. And although most of you have traded in your uniform for public service, your country needs you one more time. The world watched President Trump tell his big lie. The world watched his supporters come to Washington at his invitation. And the world watched as he told his supporters to march here to the Capitol. And President Trump, our commander-in-chief at the time, failed to take any action to defend us, as he utterly failed in his duty to preserve, protect, and defend. And now, the world is watching us, wondering whether our constitutional republic is going to respond the way it should, the way it's supposed to.
Nope.
Whether the rule of law will prevail over mob rule? Because the answer to that question has consequences far beyond our own borders. Think of the consequences to our diplomats and negotiators as they sit at tables around the world to enforce our agenda on trade, the economy, and human rights. To fail to convict a president of the United States who incited a deadly insurrection,
UND Sweaty, this
who
is
acted in concert with a violent mob,
impeachment trial of Trump,
who interfered with the
second,
certification
or the third day,
of the
I guess.
Electoral College votes,
This is
who
live.
abdicated his duty as commander-in-chief, would be to forfeit the power of our example as a North Star on freedom, democracy, human rights, and most of all, on the rule of law. And to convict Donald Trump would mean that America stands for the rule of law, no matter who violates it. Let us show the world that January 6th was not America. And let us remind the world that we are truly their North Star.
Representative Neguse and I will now address the First Amendment argument that's being offered by President Trump's lawyers to try to excuse his incitement to this insurrection, and Mr. Neguse will begin.
He's got some heat.
Mr. President, distinguished senators, good afternoon. You have heard over the course of the last several days overwhelming evidence that President Trump incited an insurrection. But as lead manager Raskin mentioned, as we prepare to close, we'd be remiss if we didn't just briefly address apparently the principal defense that the president will offer to excuse his conduct, and that is this notion that he can't be held accountable for what happened on January 6th because his actions are somehow protected by the First Amendment. Now, let's stop a moment and try to really understand the argument that they are making. According to President Trump, everything he did, everything we showed you that he did, was perfectly okay for him to do, and for a future president to do again. And the Constitution, apparently, in their view, forbids you from doing anything to stop it. That can't be right. It can't be. And it isn't right. Their argument is meant as a distraction. They are concerned not with the facts that actually occurred, the facts that we've proven, but with an alternative set of facts, where President Trump did nothing but deliver a controversial speech at a rally. Of course, that's not what we've charged in the article of impeachment, and it's not what happened. You will hear from my colleague, lead manager Raskin, the many myriad reasons why this argument that they make is wrong on the law, completely. Not just around the edges. They make major, fundamental mistakes of constitutional law, the kind that lead manager Raskin tells me wouldn't cut it in his first year law course, which of course he certainly would know since he has taught this subject for decades.
Right.
And that explains why so many lawyers who've dedicated their lives to protecting free speech, including many of the nation's most prominent conservative free speech lawyers, have described President Trump's First Amendment claims as, quote, legally frivolous.
Right.
It's another quote from a recent letter from prominent free speech lawyers that, quote, the First Amendment is no bar to the Senate convicting former President Trump and disqualifying him from holding future office. Their argument is wrong on the facts, wrong on the law, and would flip the Constitution upside down. Let's start with the facts. Because as you'll see, his free speech claim depends on an account of what he did, of why we're here, that has no basis in the evidence. To hear his lawyers tell it, he was just some guy at a rally expressing unpopular opinions.
Right.
They would have you believe that this whole impeachment is because he said things that one may disagree with. Really? And make no mistake, they will do anything to avoid talking about the facts of this case. That I can assure you. Instead, we expect they will talk about a lot of other speeches, including some given by Democratic officials, and they will insist with indignation that the First Amendment protects all of this as though it were exactly the same.
He's got heat. He's cooking right now.
We trust you to know the difference.
This man is cooking.
Because you've seen the evidence that we've seen. You've seen, as we've proven over the last 3 days, that his arguments completely misdescribe the reality of what happened on January 6th. They leave out everything that matters about why we're here and what he did. Because President Trump wasn't just some guy with political opinions who showed up at a rally on January 6th and delivered controversial remarks. He was the President of the United States. And he had spent months using the unique power of that office, of his bully pulpit, to spread that big lie that the election had been stolen, to convince his followers to stop the steal, to assemble them just blocks away from here on January 6th, at the very moment that we were meeting to count the electoral college votes, where he knew, where it had been widely reported that they were primed and eager and ready for violence at his signal.
Right.
And then, standing in the middle of that explosive situation, in that powder keg that he had created over the course of months, before a crowd filled with people that were poised for violence, at his signal, he struck a match, and he aimed it straight at this building, at us. You've seen all that evidence. There's no denying it. That's why the House impeached him. That's why he's on trial. No president, no matter their politics or the politics of their followers, conservative, liberal, or anything else, no president can do what President Trump did. Because this isn't about politics. It's about his refusal to accept the outcome of the election and his decision to incite an insurrection. And there's no serious argument that the First Amendment protects that. And it would be extraordinarily dangerous for the United States Senate to conclude otherwise. To tell future presidents that they can do exactly what President Trump did and get away with it. To set the precedent that this is an acceptable, now a constitutionally protected way to respond to losing an election. And you'll notice something, certainly something Lead Manager Raskin and I noticed, which is that by all accounts, it doesn't appear that President Trump's lawyers disagree. I mean, they don't insist that if the facts we've charged, the facts that we have proven, the facts supported by overwhelming evidence are true, as of course you now know they are, that there's nothing you can do. They're not arguing that it's okay for a person to incite a mob to violence. At least I don't think they're arguing that. Instead, what they are doing is offering a radically different version of what happened that day. totally inconsistent with the evidence. And then they insist that if that fictional version of events, if that alternate reality were true, well, then he may be protected by the First Amendment. That's their argument. But you are here to adjudicate real evidence, real facts, not hypothetical ones. And for that reason alone, you should reject their argument, because it has been advanced to defend a situation that bears no resemblance to the actual facts of this case. With that, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Lead Manager Raskin, to address the many legal flaws, as I mentioned, in President Trump's position.
So Mr. Neguse just explained why President Trump's last-ditch First Amendment arguments got nothing to do with the actual facts of the case. He's been impeached for inciting violent insurrection against the government. Incitement to violent insurrection is not protected by free speech. There is no First Amendment defense to impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors. Right. The idea itself is absurd.
Right.
And the whole First Amendment smokescreen is a completely irrelevant distraction from the standard of high crimes and misdemeanors governing a president who has violated his oath of office. Yet, President Trump, we know, has a good way of treating up as down and wrong as right.
Right.
He tried to pull off the biggest election fraud in American history by overturning the results of the 2020 election, even as he insisted that his own fraud was in fact an effort to stop the steal, to stop a fraud, a vast conspiracy that he blamed on local and state officials of both political parties, the media, election officials, the judiciary, federal, state, members of Congress, many others. Anybody who wouldn't go along with him was part of the conspiracy. He violated his own oath of office by inciting mob violence to prevent Congress from counting the Electoral College votes as we're assigned to do by the 12th Amendment and the Electoral Count Act, even as he attacked Vice President Pence at a rally for violating his oath of office and going along with an egregious assault on democracy. Now he argues that the Congress is violating his free speech rights when it was Donald Trump who incited an insurrectionist attack against us that halted speech and debate on the floor of the House and the Senate during the peaceful transfer of power, and that imperiled the very constitutional order that protects freedom of speech in the first place, along with all of our other fundamental rights. As a matter of law, as a matter of logic, President Trump's brazen attempt to invoke the First Amendment now won't hold up in any way. The basic flaw, of course, is that it completely ignores the fact that he was president of the United States, a public official. He swears an oath as president that nobody else swears. In exchange, he's given greater powers than anybody else in the entire country, maybe on earth. He or she promises to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and our government institutions.
Sorry, I
and
had to
our
take
people.
a phone call and check on something.
And as we all know, the power we entrust to people in public office, in government office, especially our presidents, comes with special obligations to uphold the laws and the integrity of our republic. And we all swear that oath. Now, what if a president publicly, say a president publicly and on a daily basis advocated replacing the Constitution with a totalitarian form of government, and urged states to secede from the Union, and swore an oath of loyalty to a foreign leader or foreign government? Well, as a private citizen, you couldn't do anything about people using those words to advocate totalitarianism, to advocate secession from the Union, to swear an oath of personal loyalty to a foreign leader or a foreign government or country. You couldn't. That's totally protected. If you tried to prosecute somebody for that, as a prosecutor, you would lose. But it is simply inconceivable, unthinkable, that a president could do any of these things. Get up and swear an oath to foreign governments or leaders, advocate totalitarianism, advocate secession, and not be impeached for it. It's just unthinkable that that could happen. Would that violate their First Amendment rights? The opposite view pressed here by President Trump's counsel would leave the nation powerless to respond to a president who uses the unmatched power, privilege, and prestige of his or her office, the famous bully pulpit, in ways that risk the ruin of the republic, all for his or her own ambition and corruption and lust for power. Everyone should be clear. There's nothing remotely exotic about what we're saying. It should be common sense to everybody. Common sense about this understanding of the First Amendment as it applies to public servants, cops, firefighters, teachers, everybody across the land. My daughter, who I mentioned earlier in the trial, she's a teacher in a public school. The courts have said teachers teach, but if they go off script and they start advocating totalitarianism, treason, or what have you, they're not living up to the duties of their office as teacher, they can be fired. Everybody knows that. And it happens all the time, by the way, including to cops and firefighters and people on the front lines. It happens all the time. In fact, it happened countless times to people fired by President Trump for their statements or ideas about things, including on election fraud, not long ago. There were people in the government who lost their jobs because the president didn't like what they said or what they wrote. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, and I can't help but repeat it, Justice Scalia got it exactly right on this. He wrote on these cases about how the First Amendment affects people who take on a public office, who take on public employment. And he summed it up like this. He said, you can't ride with the cops, but root for the robbers.
Right.
You can't ride with the cops, but root for the robbers. That's what Justice Scalia said. And when it comes to the peaceful transfer of power, to the rule of law, to respecting election outcomes, our president, whoever he or she is, must choose the side of the Constitution. Must. And not the side of the insurrection or the coup or anybody who's coming against us. And if he or she chooses the wrong side, I'm sorry, there's nothing in the First Amendment or anywhere else in the Constitution that can excuse your betrayal of your oath of office. It's not a free speech question. But there's more. Let's play make-believe and pretend that President Trump were just a run-of-the-mill private citizen, as my colleague Mr. Nagu said, just another guy at the rally who's just expressing a deeply unpopular opinion, because we shouldn't overlook the fact that while there were thousands of people in that violent mob, they represent a tiny, tiny, tiny part of less than 1% of the population, and the vast majority of the American people reject the kind of seditious mob violence that we saw on January 6th. But let's say that you were just another guy in the crowd that day. It is a bedrock principle that nobody can incite a riot. The First Amendment doesn't protect it. Key case, Brandenburg versus Ohio. There's no First Amendment protection for speech directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and likely to produce such action. And for all the reasons you've heard, based on the voluminous, comprehensive, totally unrefuted, and we think irrefutable, but we're eager to hear our colleagues, based on all the evidence you've heard, and for all the reasons you've heard, that definition of proscribable speech fits President Trump's conduct perfectly. This is a classic case of incitement. And you don't have to take my word for it. The 144 free speech lawyers Mr. Nagu mentioned, who include many of the nation's most dedicated, most uncompromising free speech advocates, unlike Mr. Trump, of course, but these people agree that there is a powerful case for conviction under the Brandenburg standard, even if the President of the United States were just to be treated like some guy in the crowd. And they add, the First Amendment is no defense to the article of impeachment leveled against the former president. And I mention the Brandenburg standard not because it applies here. Of course it doesn't, since this is an impeachment. It's not a criminal trial, and there's no risk of jail time. Let's be clear about that. The president doesn't go to jail for 1 week, 1 day, 1 hour, or 1 minute based on impeachment and conviction and disqualification from further office. Rather, I mention it to emphasize that absolutely nobody in America would be protected by the First Amendment if they did all the things that Donald Trump did. Nobody made Donald Trump run for president and swear an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution on January 20th, 2017. But when he did, by virtue of swearing that oath and entering this high office, he took upon himself a duty to affirmatively take care that our laws would be faithfully executed under his leadership. All of the laws against federal destruction of property, all of the laws. We expected him in everything he said and everything he did to protect and preserve and defend our constitutional system, including the separation of powers. But instead, he betrayed us, and as Representative Cheney said, it was the greatest betrayal of a presidential oath in the history of the United States of America. The greatest. As I mentioned yesterday, President Trump is not even close to the proverbial citizen who falsely shouts fire in a crowded theater. He is like the now proverbial municipal fire chief who incites a mob to go set the theater on fire and not only refuses to put out the fire, but encourages the mob to keep going as the blaze spreads. We would hold that fire chief accountable. We would forbid him from that job ever again, and that's exactly what must happen here. There are hundreds of millions of citizens who can be president. Donald Trump has disqualified himself, and you must disqualify him too. Just like the fire chief who sends the mob, President Trump perverted his office by attacking the very Constitution he was sworn to uphold. In fact, that's one reason why this free speech rhetoric at this trial is so insidious. His conduct represented the most devastating and dangerous assault by a government official on our Constitution, including the First Amendment in living memory. We wouldn't have free speech or any other rights if we didn't have the rule of law, peaceful transfer of power, and a democracy where the outcome of the election is accepted by the candidate who lost. We had it all the way up until 2020.
All right.
And the central purposes of the First Amendment are democratic self-government and civic truth-seeking, two purposes that President Trump sought to undermine, not advance, in the course of his conduct, as we have definitively demonstrated at this trial. The violence he incited threatened all of our freedoms. It threatened the very constitutional order that protects free speech, due process, religious free exercise, the right to vote, equal protection, and the many other fundamental rights that we all treasure and cherish as citizens of the United States. The First Amendment does not create some superpower immunity from impeachment for a president who attacks the Constitution in word and deed while rejecting the outcome of an election he happened to lose. If anything, President Trump's conduct was an assault on the First Amendment and equal protection rights that millions of Americans exercised when they voted last year, often under extraordinarily difficult and arduous circumstances. Remember, the First Amendment protects the right of the people to speak about the great issues of our day, to debate during elections, and then to participate in politics by selecting the people who will be our leaders. And remember, in American democracy, those of us who aspire and attain to public office are nothing but the servants of the people. Nothing. Not the masters of the people. We have no kings here. We have no czars. Here the people govern, President Ford said. The people. Most important words of the Constitution are the first three, we the people. But all this means little if a president who dislikes the election results can incite violence to try to replace and usurp the will of the people, as expressed in the states. Ignore the judicial branch of government and then run over the legislative branch of government with a mob. President Trump's high crimes and misdemeanors sought to nullify the political rights and sovereignty of the American people. Our right as a people to deliberate, to form opinions, to persuade each other to vote, and then to decide who our president will be. The sovereignty of the people. That's an attack on the First Amendment, I would say. In addition, President Trump's actions were a direct attack on our own freedom of speech here in the Capitol. Members of Congress are sent here to speak for their constituents. That's why we have our own little mini free speech clause, the speech and debate clause. That's literally our job. We come here and represent the views of our people. The attack that President Trump incited forced members of Congress to stop speaking and to literally flee for our lives and the lives of our staffs and our families.
That's facts.
The man whose statements and actions halted speech in Congress, speech related to the peaceful transfer of power, has no right to claim that free speech principles prevent this body from exercising its constitutional powers to hold him accountable for his offense against us. You know, Voltaire said famously, and our founders knew it, "I may disagree with everything you say, but I will defend with my life your right to say it." President Trump says, "Because I disagree with everything you say, I will overturn your popular election and incite insurrection against the government." And we might take a moment to consider another Voltaire insight, which a high school teacher of mine told me when a student asked, "When was the beginning of the Enlightenment?" And she said, "I think it was when Voltaire said, 'Anyone who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities.'" There's no merit whatsoever to any of the free speech rhetoric, the empty free speech rhetoric you may hear from President Trump's lawyers. He attacked the First Amendment. He attacked the Constitution. He betrayed his oath of office. Presidents don't have any right to do that. It's forbidden, so that our republic may survive. The people are far more important than that. The precedent he asks you to create, which would allow any future president to do precisely what he did, is self-evidently dangerous. And so there can be no doubt, none at all, the president lacks any First Amendment excuse or defense or immunity. He incited a violent insurrection against our government. He must be convicted. And now I'm going to call up Representative Dean, who will explain why, contrary to the president's claims, the House provided him with all the process that was due to him in this impeachment process. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Liu is going to do that.
All right. Thank you for your time and your attention. We all heard President Trump's attorneys on Tuesday, and as part of President Trump's efforts to avoid talking about his own conduct, to avoid talking about anything related to his constitutional crime, we expect that President Trump will raise process objections. His due process claims are without merit. Under the Constitution, the House has, quote, the sole power of impeachment. That provision confirms that the House functions as a grand jury or a prosecutor. The House decides whether to bring charges. Now, in other impeachment cases, the House has provided certain deliberative and procedural privileges to the person being impeached, but those are exactly that, privileges. They are discretionary. The House has the power to decide its own rules, how it wants to pass the article of impeachment, and in this case, the House debated the article of impeachment and passed it on a bipartisan vote. I'm a former prosecutor, and I just want to add that I've had the opportunity to decide whether to bring charges. And when you see a crime committed in plain view, prosecutors don't have to spend months investigating before they bring charges. I note that in this case, in fact, hundreds of people have been arrested and charged by prosecutors for the violence on January 6th. There was no reason for the House to wait to impeach the man at the very top that incited the violence. I'd also like to emphasize that the House had good reason to move quickly. This was an exigent circumstance. This was not a case where there was hidden conduct or some conspiracy that required months and maybe years of investigation. This case does not raise very complicated legal issues. The gravity of the president's conduct demanded the clearest of responses from the legislature, particularly given that the president was still in office at the time the House approved this article, and rumors of further violence echoed around the country. They still do. There must be absolutely no doubt that Congress will act decisively against a president that incites violence against us. That is why the House moved quickly here. And President Trump, who created that emergency, cannot be heard to complain that the House impeached him too quickly for the emergency he caused. Another point on the due process question. Earlier in this trial, President Trump's attorneys suggested that the House somehow deliberately delayed the transmission of this article of impeachment. That is simply not accurate. When the House adopted this article of impeachment on a bipartisan vote, we were ready to begin trial. But the Senate was not in session at the time. And when we inquired as to our options, Senate officials told us clearly and in no uncertain terms that if the clerk of the House attempted to deliver the article of impeachment to the Secretary of the Senate before the Senate reconvened, that the clerk of the House would have been turned back at the door. That's why the trial did not begin then. It's another reason why the president's objections of due process are meritless. And finally, let me just conclude that you all are going to see and have seen a full presentation of evidence by the House, and you're going to hear a full presentation by the president's attorneys. You're going to be able to ask questions. The Senate has the sole power to try all impeachments. President Trump is receiving any and all process that he is due right here in this chamber.
Mr. President, Senators, in just a moment, my colleague, Mr. Neguse, will return to show that we've established with overwhelming evidence that President Trump engaged in high crimes and misdemeanors. Before Mr. Neguse comes up, though, I'd like to emphasize what should be an uncontroversial point, but is really key to understand. If we have proven to you the conduct that we've alleged in this article, then President Trump has indeed committed a high crime and misdemeanor under the Constitution. Incitement of insurrection under these circumstances is undoubtedly, in the words of George Mason from the Constitutional Convention, a great and dangerous offense against the Republic. Indeed, it is hard to think of a greater or more dangerous offense against the Republic than this one. So, to be very precise about this, I hope we all can agree today that if a president does incite a violent insurrection against the government, he can be impeached for it. I hope we all can agree that that is a constitutional crime. Another key point, while President Trump's lawyers may be arguing otherwise, the question here is not whether President Trump committed a crime under the federal code or DC law or the law of any state. Impeachment does not result in criminal penalties, as we keep emphasizing. No one spends a day in jail. There are not even criminal or civil fines. Centuries of history, not to mention the constitutional text, structure, and original intent and understanding, all confirm the teaching of James Wilson, another framer who wrote that impeachments and offenses come not within the sphere of ordinary jurisprudence. Simply put, impeachment was created for a purpose separate and distinct from criminal punishment. It was created to prevent and deter elected officials who swear an oath to represent America, but then commit dangerous offenses against our republic. That's a constitutional crime. And senators, what greater offense could one commit than to incite a violent insurrection at our seat of government during the peaceful transfer of power? In circumstances where violence is foreseeable, where a crowd is poised for violence to provoke a mob of thousands to attack us with weapons and sticks and poles, to bludgeon and beat our law enforcement officers, and to deface these sacred walls, and to trash the place, and to do so while seeking to stop us from fulfilling our own oaths, our own duties to uphold the Constitution by counting the votes from our free and fair elections, and then to sit back and watch in delight as insurrectionists attack us, violating a sacred oath and engaging in a profound dereliction and desertion of duty? How can we assure that our Commander-in-Chief will protect, preserve, and defend us and our Constitution if we don't hold a president accountable in a circumstance like this? What is impeachable conduct if not this? I challenge you all to think about it. If you think this is not impeachable, what is? What would be? If President Trump's lawyers endorse his breathtaking assertion that his conduct in inciting these events was totally appropriate, and the Senate acquits Donald Trump, then any president could incite and provoke insurrectionary violence against us again. If you don't find this a high crime and misdemeanor today, you have set a new terrible standard for presidential misconduct in the United States of America. The only real question here is the factual one. Did we prove that Donald Trump, while President of the United States, incited a violent insurrection against the government? Incitement, of course, is an inherently fact-based and fact-intensive judgment, which is why we commend you all for your scrupulous attention to everything that took place. But we believe that we have shown you and why you must convict, and then we will rest. Mr. Neguse.
Sorry. I don't know why my stream dropped like that. But I'm back.
Mr. President, distinguished senators, good afternoon again. As my colleague, Lead Manager Raskin, mentioned, I know it's been a long few days, and I want to say thank you, that we're very grateful for your, as Lead Manager Raskin mentioned, I hope, I trust that we could all agree that if a president incites a violent insurrection against our government, that that's impeachable conduct. So what I'd like to do as we close our case is just walk you through why our evidence overwhelmingly establishes that President Trump committed that offense. Now, as you consider that question of whether the president incited an insurrection, there are three questions that reasonably come to mind. Was violence foreseeable? Did he encourage violence? And did he act willfully? And I'm going to show you why the answer to every one of those questions has to be yes. First, let's start with foreseeability. Was it foreseeable that the violence would erupt on January 6th if President Trump lit a spark? Was it predictable that the crowd at the Save America rally was poised on a hair trigger for violence, that they would fight, literally, if provoked to do so? Of course it was. When President Trump stood up to that podium on January 6th, he knew that many in that crowd were inflamed, were armed, were ready for violence. It was an explosive situation, and he knew it. We've shown you the evidence on this point, you've seen it. The images, the videos, the articles, and the pattern, which show that the violence on that terrible day was entirely foreseeable. We've showed you how this all began with the big lie, the claim that the election was